"Please, take them off," she said. And when the rancher opened the sack, what he saw left him. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the rolling hills that stretched for miles around Jake's ranch. The quiet was something he had grown used to, the kind of silence that seemed endless in its beauty. Jake loved his life on the ranch. There were no busy city streets, no constant noise, just wide-open spaces and fresh air. He had inherited this land from his father, who had built the ranch from the ground up, and Jake took great pride in continuing the family legacy. On most mornings, Jake spent the first few hours of daylight tending to his cattle, checking on the barns and making sure everything was running smoothly. The chores were simple but necessary, part of the rhythm of life on a ranch. He'd been doing this for years now, and it had become second nature to him. The routine of it was comforting, and the work, though hard, kept his mind clear. But today, something was different. As Jake walked along the fence line that bordered the far edge of the property, something caught his eye. It was a small, dark shape sitting at the base of a tree, half hidden by the long grasses. At first, Jake thought it might be a pile of old branches or some discarded equipment from a previous workday. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't anything like that. It was a sack. A large, heavy sack, and it looked strangely out of place. Jake stopped for a moment, his hand resting on the worn fence post. He couldn't remember ever seeing anything like it around these parts. The sack was old, its fabric frayed and dirty, but it seemed too purposeful to be abandoned by accident. Jake took a deep breath, his curiosity pulling him toward it. He'd learned long ago not to ignore strange things on the ranch, especially when they seemed so far out of place. He walked carefully toward the sack, each step crunching softly on the dirt. His boots stirred up small clouds of dust as he approached, and his eyes never left the bag. The closer he got, the heavier it seemed to become, though he knew it couldn't really be. It was just the mystery of it that felt so weighted. When he was finally standing right next to it, Jake crouched down and took hold of the sack's rough, tattered edges. He could feel the weight of whatever was inside shift slightly, and his mind immediately began racing with questions. What was this? Who had left it here? And why? Just as he was about to untie the bag to see what was inside, a soft voice stopped him. Please! Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard anyone approach, and the voice was so unexpected that it made him jump back, his hand still gripping the sack. The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it carried a sense of urgency that Jake couldn't ignore. He turned quickly, expecting to see a stranger or someone in distress, but what he saw made him freeze. A woman stood just a few feet away from him, her face pale and her clothes torn and ragged. She was a strange sight in this isolated part of the ranch, and Jake couldn't help but notice how out of place she seemed. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Despite the obvious signs of exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her gaze. Jake's mind raced as he took in her appearance. She didn't look like someone who belonged in this part of the country. Her clothes, though worn and dirty, didn't seem like the kind of thing a rancher would wear. Her boots were too soft, too polished, and her cloak seemed like something from a different time. Her appearance was so out of place it almost felt like she had stepped out of a dream or a strange memory. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. He had seen his fair share of tough situations on the ranch, but something about this woman made his instincts go on high alert. She was obviously in trouble, and it was clear she hadn't come all the way out here for no reason. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to Jake, her eyes darting nervously to the sack in his hands. "Please, take them off," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. There was a desperation in her words, something that tugged at Jake's heart. For a moment, Jake wasn't sure what she meant. "Take them off! The sack!" What could she be referring to? But then, his curiosity overtook his confusion, and he realized that whatever was in that sack, it was connected to this woman in some way. He looked back down at the bag in his hands and began to untie the knot, each movement slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that opening the sack was a step into something he didn't fully understand. Something told him that what he was about to uncover would change everything. As the knot finally loosened, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Inside the sack was a bundle, tightly wrapped in cloth. its edges worn and frayed. It was heavier than it looked, and Jake wondered for a brief moment just how much weight something so small could carry. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled at the cloth, peeling it back to reveal what lay beneath. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Old clothes, perhaps, or something else that might have been discarded. But as Jake carefully unfolded the cloth, his heart stopped. What he saw was not what he expected. Inside the sack was a bundle, more than one. Small bundles, carefully wrapped, each one packed tightly in the cloth. Jake's stomach twisted as he realized that the sack was not filled with clothes or belongings. It was filled with something far more disturbing. He took a step back, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. The woman's soft gasp brought him back to reality. She had moved closer now, her hands shaking as she reached toward him. "Please! Help me!" she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know what else to do. Jake stared at her, still processing the sight in front of him. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but he knew better than to push someone who was clearly in distress. Whatever had brought this woman here, whatever had made her so afraid, was far bigger than he could understand in this moment. Without saying another word, Jake nodded slowly. He knew that this wasn't just a random encounter. Something had led her here, and Jake had a feeling he wouldn't be able to walk away from this mystery without knowing more. "Let's get you inside," Jake said, his voice calm though his mind was racing. "You're safe here. We'll figure this out." And as he helped the woman towards his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a story that was far from over. Jake led the woman into the small cabin on his ranch, a sturdy structure built long ago by his father. The room was simple, yet warm. The rough wooden walls were lined with shelves full of books, tools, and a few knickknacks from years of living out here. A fire crackled gently in the stone fireplace, filling the space with a welcoming glow. It was the kind of place where people felt safe, even if only for a short time. The woman's steps were slow and hesitant as she entered, her eyes scanning the room as though looking for something or someone. She didn't seem to notice the warmth of the fire or the quiet comfort of the cabin. Her mind, Jake could tell, was elsewhere, and he could see the weight of whatever burden she carried in the way she moved, slightly hunched, her shoulders tense as though she was still waiting for something terrible to happen. Jake motioned to a chair by the fire and helped her sit down, watching as she lowered herself carefully, as though the simple act of sitting down might break her. She didn't say a word at first, her eyes fixed on the floor, lost in her own thoughts. Jake grabbed a clean cup from the counter, filling it with water from the well outside. He placed it gently in front of her. "Drink this! It'll help," he said, his voice soft but firm. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She reached for the cup, her hands shaking slightly as she took a sip, but didn't say anything. He waited for her to speak, not wanting to push her but knowing that the silence was too heavy to continue for long. It hung in the air between them like a thick fog. He could tell that whatever had brought her to this point was far more complicated than anything he could understand in a single moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she took a deep breath and looked up at Jake. Her eyes were filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place, regret, fear, and something darker, deeper, that he couldn't name.
"I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
The words were fragile, as if they were breaking apart with each syllable. Jake leaned forward, his interest piqued. He wasn't sure if she would continue, but he had a feeling that once she started, there would be no stopping her. I came from a small town," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "Not far from here. I thought I could escape, but—" She stopped herself, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She took another deep breath, as though gathering the strength to go on. Jake remained silent, his eyes soft and understanding. He could see how difficult it was for her to open up. But he knew that if she was going to heal, if she was going to survive, she would have to speak about whatever had happened. "I was a nurse," she continued, her voice stronger now, though still shaky. "I worked at the local clinic in town. There were a lot of people who depended on me, but things changed so quickly. One day, people started getting sick, and we didn't know why. She paused, her eyes looking far away as if she were seeing something Jake could not.
It wasn't just the normal kind of sickness. It was something worse. People would get feverish, weak.
Then they started dying. Fast.
Every day, more and more people. They called it an epidemic, but no one knew what caused it.
No one had answers. Jake sat back in his chair, trying to absorb the words she was saying.
An epidemic! It sounded like something out of a bad dream.
But the woman's eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, made it all too real.
I tried to help!
We all did. The doctors, the nurses, we did what we could. But the disease spread so fast, it was like we were fighting a losing battle from the start. People were dying by the dozens, and we couldn't stop it. She shook her head, a look of despair washing over her. He had lived through a few difficult seasons, but he had never experienced something so devastating. He could only imagine the weight of being a caregiver during a time of such loss.
It got worse,
she continued, her voice now filled with a quiet desperation.
One night, a family came into the clinic. They were the last of their kind. No one else in town was left. They brought in a baby, a little girl, only a few months old.
She was sick too, but she wasn't like the others. She was different. Her voice broke, and she stopped speaking for a moment to steady herself. Jake's heart raced.
What was she saying? What did this have to do with the sack? What was the significance of this girl? She was infected, the woman said,
barely able to keep the words steady. But she was still alive, and the others weren't.
She paused again, her lips trembling. I didn't know what to do.
So I made a decision. It was the only choice I had left. Jake leaned in, his eyes focused on her every word, but he didn't interrupt. She needed to say this, to get it out. I didn't know what would happen, she whispered, but I gave the baby. I gave her the medicine. The one they told us we couldn't use.
The one that was supposed to be too dangerous, but I used it anyway, I thought. I thought I was saving her. I thought it was the right thing to do.
She wiped away a tear, her hands trembling now. But it wasn't. It wasn't the right choice. It turned out. She stopped, her chest rising and falling rapidly as though she were struggling to breathe.
It turned out the baby was infected.
And what I did, it made things worse. It didn't save her. It made everything worse.
And now she's gone.
The silence that followed her words felt suffocating. Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. The woman's guilt was heavy in the air, as though it were something he could physically touch. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew this wasn't the end of the story.
It couldn't be. What did you do?
Jake finally asked, his voice gentle. Afterward, what did you do? Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked like a broken woman, lost in a sea of regrets she couldn't escape. I had to leave.
I couldn't stay in the town anymore, not after everything that happened. I thought I could run away, maybe find some peace.
She looked down at her hands, her voice becoming barely audible.
But I couldn't escape what I had done.
Jake didn't know what to say, but the words that followed his lips were the only ones he could offer.
You don't have to face this alone, he said softly. You can stay here, with me. Take some time, we'll figure this out. Together!
She looked up at him, the faintest spark of hope flickering in her eyes.
It wasn't much, but it was a start.
And as she nodded, finally allowing herself to relax just a little, Jake knew that whatever had happened, he wasn't going to let her go through this alone.
He didn't know the full story yet, but he would.
And whatever came next, they would face it together. The days that followed felt strange to Jake. He had lived alone on the ranch for years, but now, with the woman, whose name was Emily, staying with him, the place felt different. There was an unsettling quiet, a tension that lingered in the air. Emily wasn't fully healed from what she had been through, and Jake could tell that she was fighting battles in her mind that no one else could understand. Though she didn't say much, Emily spent most of her time sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in her thoughts.
Jake tried to give her space, but the silence between them was thick. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of someone enjoying solitude.
It was the kind of silence that felt oppressive, like something unsaid was hanging between them, waiting to be addressed. Jake went about his usual routine, checking on the cattle and repairing parts of the fence that had been damaged by a storm.
He worked hard trying to keep his mind busy. But even as he worked, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily. The guilt and pain in her eyes were hard to forget. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how.
The whole situation felt out of his control. One afternoon, after finishing up in the barn, Jake walked into the cabin to find Emily sitting at the table. She was holding something in her hands, her fingers brushing over it gently, almost as if she was afraid it might break. When she saw him, she quickly hid it beneath a cloth, but Jake noticed.
He could tell there was something important, something that was weighing on her, but she wasn't ready to share it yet.
"Emily," Jake said softly, his voice gentle as he took a step closer.
"You don't have to hide anything from me."
She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, unsure of what to say. After a long pause, she sighed deeply and slowly pulled the cloth off the object in her hands.
It was a small, delicate wooden box. The box looked old, worn, and fragile, as if it had been passed down through generations.
There were intricate carvings on the sides, but the details were so faded that it was hard to tell what they were anymore. Jake could see that the box meant something to her. It was obvious from the way she held it so carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world.
"This was my grandmother's," Emily said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. "She gave it to me when I was young. It's the only thing I have left from her."
Jake didn't speak right away, allowing her to gather her thoughts. He could see the pain on her face as she traced the carvings with her fingertips. It was clear that the box held more than just memories for her.
It was a connection to her past, to the person she had lost. "I used to keep it hidden," she continued, her voice shaking slightly. "When the sickness started, I thought I could protect it, but everything went wrong. I couldn't protect anyone."
The words hung in the air between them. Emily's guilt was still weighing heavily on her, and Jake could see how it was tearing her apart. He stepped closer, sitting down beside her at the table.
He didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing for sure. Emily needed someone to listen. She needed to share her story, to unburden herself. "Emily," Jake said softly, "I know you're carrying a heavy load, but you don't have to carry it alone." She looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness.
She wanted to say something, but her words faltered.
Instead, she opened the wooden box, revealing a small piece of cloth inside. Carefully, she unwrapped it, revealing a faded photograph.
The picture showed a woman holding a baby in her arms, both smiling brightly. The woman in the photo looked kind, her face warm with love, while the baby looked content and safe in her embrace.
"That's my grandmother," Emily said, her voice trembling. "And that's me. I was just a baby when this picture was taken."
There was love in the photo, but there was also the unmistakable pain of loss. The photograph was a reminder of a time before the sickness, before everything changed.
"I don't know what happened to my grandmother," Emily continued. She was taken by the illness. She was one of the first ones, but before she passed, she told me to keep the box safe," she said. "It was a symbol of our family's strength."
Emily paused, her eyes now distant as if she were lost in a memory. Jake sat quietly beside her, letting her speak at her own pace. He didn't rush her. She needed time. "I tried to protect it," Emily whispered.
"But when the sickness spread, when people started dying, I
couldn't save anyone.
I couldn't even save the baby."
She took a shaky breath, and Jake could see the tears welling up in her eyes.
"I didn't know what to do. I was a nurse. I was supposed to know how to help, but I couldn't. And now I'm here, far away from everything, with nothing but the memory of what happened."
He couldn't imagine the weight of the guilt she must have felt knowing that she had lost so much. He wanted to help, but he didn't have all the answers. He could see that Emily was still trying to make sense of the past, still carrying the burden of her choices.
Emily,
Jake said gently, placing a hand on hers.
You didn't cause the sickness. You didn't make those decisions alone. But you're here now.
And you're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can do. Emily turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to consider his words carefully before nodding slowly, as if they were starting to make sense. For the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something other than guilt in her eyes, a small spark of hope.
I never wanted to leave my family behind,
she said, her voice quieter now.
But after everything that happened, I had to go. I thought if I left, I could escape it.
I thought if I could just get far enough away, I could forget. Jake nodded slowly, understanding her pain.
It was something he had seen before. People running from their pasts, hoping to leave behind the things they couldn't change, but running didn't always work. And deep down, Emily knew that she wasn't running anymore.
You don't have to run anymore, Jake said quietly, squeezing her hand gently. You're not alone here.
You don't have to keep carrying this weight on your own.
Emily looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching for something in his face, something she had been looking for all along. And in that moment, she seemed to find it. A small, tentative smile appeared on her face, a smile that had been buried beneath layers of pain and regret.
It wasn't much, but it was a start.
Jake smiled back, his heart lightening just a little. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Emily had taken the first step toward healing, and for the first time in a long while he felt that perhaps they both could find a way to move forward, one small step at a time. The following days passed by slowly. There was a quiet calm that settled over the ranch, a peacefulness that Jake hadn't felt in a long time. Emily seemed to be adjusting, though the heaviness that clung to her like a shadow never fully lifted. She helped with small tasks around the cabin, setting the table for meals, washing the dishes, even sweeping the floor. These simple chores were something she could control, something that gave her a small sense of purpose in the midst of all the turmoil in her mind. Jake didn't push her to talk. He knew that healing couldn't be rushed, especially not after what she had been through. But little by little he could see small changes in her. Her shoulders were less tense, her steps more confident. She had started to open up more, telling Jake little bits about her life before the sickness took over. The memories were bittersweet for her, but they were also important. She needed to remember who she had been, not just who she was now. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Emily sat outside on the porch, staring at the horizon. The sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the air, a familiar song of the countryside. Jake watched her from the doorway, unsure of whether he should disturb her, but something told him that this was a moment she might need to share. He stepped outside and sat down beside her. Emily didn't look at him immediately, but she acknowledged his presence with a small nod. She had grown accustomed to him being there, and Jake was content to let her lead the conversation when she was ready. He knew this was her journey, and he was just there to support her along the way.
It's beautiful here, Emily said quietly, her voice soft and almost wistful. I never thought I would find a place like this.
After everything that happened, I didn't know if I'd ever feel peace again. Jake turned to look at her, his heart heavy with sympathy. He knew that the peace she sought wasn't just about finding a quiet place to live.
It was about finding a way to live with what had happened, to come to terms with the choices she had made and the things she had lost. You'll find it, Emily, Jake said gently, his voice steady. Peace doesn't come overnight. It takes time, but it's there, even when it seems far away.
She glanced at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and doubt.
I'm not sure I deserve peace, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After everything I did, the people I couldn't save, how do you move on from that? How do you live with the fact that you couldn't do enough?
Jake's heart ached for her, for the weight of the guilt that still pressed down on her chest.
He could see how much she had internalized the loss, how deeply she had blamed herself. It was a burden no one should have to carry alone, but Emily had carried it for far too long. "None of us can save everyone," Jake said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You did everything you could."
"That's all anyone can do. You're not a failure. You're human, and sometimes, no matter how hard we try, things don't turn out the way we want. But that doesn't make us bad people. It makes us people who care, who feel, and that's not something to be ashamed of."
Emily turned to him, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to find the truth in his words. She didn't speak for a long while, and Jake didn't push her. He simply sat beside her, offering her the space to process everything. Finally, Emily sighed and looked out at the horizon again. The sky had deepened to a rich purple, the stars beginning to appear one by one. "I think I'm starting to believe that," she said softly.
"Maybe not completely, but maybe I can start trying."
Jake gave her a small, encouraging smile.
"That's all you can do. Just keep trying."
The rest of the evening passed quietly, but the air between them felt lighter. Emily seemed to be at ease in a way she hadn't been before. The next morning after breakfast, she decided to take a walk around the property. Jake was surprised but pleased to see her so eager to get outside. The ranch was big, plenty of space for her to roam and explore at her own pace. As she walked through the fields, Jake followed at a distance, not wanting to intrude on her solitude, but also keeping an eye on her to make sure she didn't feel overwhelmed. Emily's steps were slow but purposeful as she moved along the edge of the land, taking in the wide open spaces. The sun was shining and a soft breeze blew through the tall grasses, making them sway like waves on the ocean. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had been her life just days before. She paused at the edge of a small creek that ran through the property, its water sparkling in the sunlight. She knelt down, running her fingers through the cool water, and for the first time in a long time, Jake saw a smile on her face.
It wasn't a huge smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. A small, quiet moment of peace that she had found on her own.
Jake approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. He didn't want to interrupt, but he couldn't help but speak.
"It's a good place to think," he said quietly. Emily looked up at him, her smile widening just a little.
"It is," she agreed. "I don't know why, but it feels like I can breathe here.
Like, maybe I don't have to carry everything all the time.
Maybe I can let go."
Jake nodded, his heart swelling with hope for her. She wasn't there yet, but he could see that she was starting to heal. The weight she had carried for so long wasn't gone, but it was starting to lighten. And that, Jake thought, was a victory in itself. "I'm glad you're here," Jake said softly.
"You deserve to find peace, Emily, and you will."
Emily's eyes met his, and for a moment the connection between them was clear. She didn't say anything, but there was a silent understanding between them. She had a long way to go, but she wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to help her find the peace she had been searching for. As the day wore on and the sun began to set, Emily and Jake walked back to the cabin together. The sky was painted with hues of gold and pink, and the quiet beauty of the land seemed to reflect the quiet progress Emily was making within herself. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but she was moving forward. And for the first time since she had arrived, Emily felt like she was finally on the path to healing.
It was a small step, but it was a start, and that was enough for now.
As the days turned into weeks, the ranch began to feel more like home to Emily. The quiet of the land, the open fields, and the gentle rhythm of life on the ranch had worked wonders on her, slowly bringing her back from the dark place she had been. There were still moments when the past haunted her, moments when the guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but with every passing day she found herself growing stronger. She didn't have all the answers, but she was starting to accept that she didn't need them all right away.
Jake had noticed the change in her, too. There was a lightness in her step now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there when she first arrived.
She smiled more often, though still faintly, and her eyes were no longer filled with the same sadness.
It was as if a weight had been lifted. bit by bit. He was glad to see the transformation, though he knew that the path to healing wasn't always smooth. There were still things Emily needed to work through, but she was no longer fighting alone.
One afternoon, Jake found Emily sitting on the porch, her legs stretched out in front of her as she looked out at the distant hills. She was holding the wooden box that had been passed down through her family, the one that held so many memories for her. It had become something of a symbol for Emily, something that reminded her of who she had been before the illness, before everything had changed. The box had been the one piece of her past that she still clung to, and in many ways it had been the starting point of her healing. Jake stepped outside and leaned against the porch railing, watching her for a moment. He could tell she was deep in thought, lost in whatever memories the box brought to her. He didn't want to interrupt, but there was something in the air, something that told him this was the moment she might finally be ready to speak more about her past.
"Are you doing okay?"
he asked, his voice soft but warm. Emily turned her head to look at him, offering a small, knowing smile.
"I think I'm getting there,"
she said quietly. Her voice was steadier now, the uncertainty of her earlier days beginning to fade. She paused for a moment, then looked back down at the box in her hands.
"I've been thinking a lot about my grandmother," she added, her tone reflective, "about what she would have wanted me to do."
Jake nodded, taking a step closer. He didn't interrupt her, sensing that she needed to express whatever was on her mind. He was patient, waiting for her to continue.
"She always said that strength isn't about never falling," Emily continued. "It's about how you get up when you do. She believed in resilience, doing the best you can, even when things don't turn out the way you want." "I used to think I understood that, but I didn't. Not until now."
It was clear that Emily was beginning to understand something she hadn't been able to grasp before. The guilt that had held her captive for so long was slowly being replaced by a sense of acceptance.
She didn't have to be perfect.
She just had to keep moving forward, even if the steps were small. "I've made mistakes," she said, her voice steady now, no longer faltering.
"Big ones! I can't undo them! But I can learn from them. And I can choose to be better." I think that's what she would have wanted. Jake walked over to her and sat down beside her on the porch.
He didn't say anything at first, just letting the quiet fill the space between them. The world around them seemed to pause for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees, the soft hum of distant insects, the sun starting to dip lower in the sky.
It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace within herself.
"I think you've come a long way," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I can see it in you."
"You've found your strength again, Emily, and that's something to be proud of."
She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, an understanding that she was finally starting to heal. It wasn't a perfect journey, and it wasn't over yet. But she was no longer running from her past. She was learning to live with it, to accept the parts of herself she had once tried to bury.
"I've been thinking about what comes next,"
Emily said after a long pause, her voice thoughtful.
"About where I go from here."
"I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to live."
"I want to find meaning in my life again."
Jake nodded.
"You've got a good start already," he said. "You found a place to start over, to rebuild."
"And you don't have to do it alone. You've got people who care about you, people who want to see you succeed." Emily smiled at his words. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear them, how much she had needed to hear that she wasn't alone in this.
For so long she had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, thinking that she had to fix everything by herself.
But Jake had shown her that it was okay to lean on others, to allow herself to be supported.
"I don't know exactly what the future holds,"
Emily said, her voice steady and confident now.
"But I do know this. I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding from my past.
And I'm ready to face whatever comes next." Jake smiled warmly, his heart swelling with pride for her. He had watched her transform over the past few weeks, seen the change in her. She was no longer the broken woman who had arrived at his door filled with guilt and despair. She was someone stronger, someone who had found the courage to keep going despite everything that had happened. And that Jake thought, was the most powerful thing of all. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land, Emily and Jake sat together in silence, the warmth of the evening surrounding them. The future was still uncertain, and there were still struggles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt ready to face whatever came her way. She had found the strength to move forward, and with that strength she knew she could rebuild her life one step at a time. Jake looked out at the land around them, a sense of peace settling over him as well. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together.
Emily had come a long way, and so had he. They had both learned that healing didn't happen overnight.
It was a slow process, a journey that took time. But with patience, with understanding, and with the support of those around them, anything was possible. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Emily and Jake sat side by side, knowing that they had both found something rare and beautiful, a second chance at peace.